Good evening, everyone, y saludos a todos. I want to first thank the Institute for the privilege of sharing my work with you tonight. It's a real gift. I gave my first paper for the Institute 47 years ago. And you know what I said? Next slide, please. This presentation covers certain cultural dynamics in the Ayacucho Basin, from the Warpa culture of the early intermediate period beginning around 250 AD, with a transition around 700 AD into the Middle Horizon Wari culture that ended around 900 AD. It is a story of images painted on pottery, carved in stone, and woven into textiles. Images created from the mysterious yet spiritual experiences of encountering the supernatural world and told from one generation to the next over centuries. Sometimes it's hard to know how to start a story, but in this case, I know exactly when and where the content of my tale originated. It was late 1997 when construction for new housing near Ayacucho's airport was about to destroy the site of Conchapata. Jose Ochotoma and Marta Cabrera began emergency excavations to save the site. A section of the site included a D-shaped ceremonial structure, as starred on the map. At one point in their effort to protect the site, Jose stood his ground in front of a backhoe, a very scary thing to do, and I applaud his bravery. Their excavation in this ceremonial structure produced significant amounts of broken polychrome pottery. Fortunately, body sherds from one jar depicted a strange plant-like image that I initially called the plant from Mars. But my down-to-earth botanical research was published in 2000 and disclosed an exceptional yet unknown aspect of Wari culture. The plant was identified as the Anadenanthera calabrina, a source for a tryptamine hallucinogen. In this presentation, I will be referring to this plant as simply A. calabrina. The identity provided the first evidence that the Wari embraced the use of psychedelic identity of this plant, of a psychedelic. Identity of this plant relies on specific design attributes. White circled black dots for the flowers, hash marks in ovate shapes for the bipinnate leaves, and black dotted elongated shapes for the leguminous seed pods. In acknowledging its presence, our views of Middle Horizon feasting practices were enhanced with the assumption that mind-altering chicha drinks were most likely involved. However, since 2000, these ideas refer to Andean cultures of the Middle Horizon as described in the Southern Andean Iconographic Series, or SACE, that William Isbell and I introduced in 2009, and not to the early intermediate period cultures. The point of this talk is to correct that omission. But first, I wish to briefly describe this Middle Horizon iconography so that you can better understand the contrast it has with the origin of the psychedelic through line beginning in the early intermediate period. The Southern Andean Iconographic Series represents a corpus of shared imagery of supernatural anthropomorphic deities. Key icons are the full-bodied, forward-facing stance of a staff god and facing to the side of a profile deity, and the rayed heads of these two. Deities are identified with divided eyes and limb bands. Iconic themes that were reproduced in distant locales support the broad Andean integrity of the SACE. For example, Dorothy Menzel's male belted and female unbelted staff gods located at the distant sites of Conchapata, Pacheco, and Tiwanaku. Another example is what I define as the captor-captive deity theme. The theme associates two profile deities. One is as a larger captor, the other a smaller captive, as depicted on these two Tiwanaku textiles. I interpret profile deities as ethnic wakas, with a spiritual-based analogy that portrays real conflicts between religious and socio-political ideologies. They both have supernatural attributes of divided eyes. The captive attributes are the emaciated ribs and tied hands. And here are examples on Wari tapestry tunics. An individual wearing such a tunic would be reaffirming their membership on the winning side. At Tiwanaku, the Kantatayita lintel displays the larger captor profile deities floating above the smaller captive profile deities that have never been detected before. During my first visit to Tiwanaku in 2000, the sun was at the perfect angle to pick up the fine details of the captive profile deities with tied hands and limb bands. I suggest that the captive deity themes provide insights into earlier social dynamics of warfare and conquest, perhaps in the guise of a mythology of battling gods. In other words, were these scenes of supernatural events an explanation of more ancient confrontations? If so, then what socio-political dynamics existed and contributed to the Middle Horizon Wari society? I am proposing an origin to this story of a psychedelic through line, with evidence that the Ayacucho populations followed inherited traditions. The psychedelic through line in the Ayacucho population, before the Middle Horizon SACE was introduced, began with the early intermediate period Warpa culture. Such an understanding has never involved the role of the Warpa culture for good reason. There are no Warpa supernatural images. But I present evidence that the use of psychedelics not only existed among the Warpa, but began the psychedelic through line that continued into the SACE and in turn promoted the proliferation of Wari identity. Here again is the basic chronology of the two cultures and a map of the Ayacucho Basin. The dating of a more detailed chronology relied on carbon-14 analyses for the most part. Of these ceramic styles, I will be focusing on the traditional Warpa black on white, the later innovations as seen in the Warpa black and red on white and Warpa tricolor, as well as its contemporary styles, white cruz pata and brown cruz pata. But keep in mind that each boundary line is more like a wavy dashed line. Warpa potters didn't disappear, but continued a constant overlapping of ceramic knowledge through various generations of potters. Evidence presented here suggests a remarkable sustainability of Warpa traditions. Early Warpa ceramics art is best known for its black on white pottery with geometric shapes painted within a gridded layout of rectangular design fields. This structured layout is a trait that continued into Wari design pottery. The variety of ceramic items include open bowls with flaring curved profiles, vase-like bowls, various jars, modeled heads, and spoons, lots of spoons. Also, an amazing ocarina-like whistle. The rim sherds of large jars with the wide-mouthed, tall neck were originally thought to belong to urn shapes as precursors to the large urns from the Wari site of Conchapata. Warpa and Nazca pottery provides evidence of an interconnection between highland and coastal populations over several centuries. The nested squares, pyramid shapes, checkerboard, and grid designs are so similar that only logic dictates that their origin is within Warpa art where these designs predominate, whereas they're rare in Nazca art. On the far right are examples of Nazca's more common, though late, artistry of colorful curvilinear motifs. As I will show in the next slides, one will see how such art influenced the late Warpa pottery manufacture. Among the many Nazca effigy bottles from the South Coast, there is a grouping of similar-looking ones that might also be evidence of coastal visits by Warpa travelers. The identity is suggestive by means of clothing patterns depicted on the vessels and similar Warpa ceramic art, though further associations are warranted. By the end of the early intermediate period, Warpa and Nazca relationships, perhaps through trade and migration, introduced the Highland potters to curvilinear motifs and more colorful designs. Their new skills show up in the white cruise pottery. Warpa black and red on white, notice all these spirals, and Warpa tricolor pottery. Now, I saw nothing in these styles that suggested psychedelic intoxication until I read about David Lewis Williams and Thomas Dawson's neuropsychological model that explains how an altered state of consciousness progresses through involuntary imagery. So now I will describe this model and how I used it to discern such evidence in Warpa art and contemporary styles. The model references shapes found in rock art with the intent that they represented shaman-like ecstatic behavior dating to the Upper Paleolithic. Based on modern observations, the shapes on the left were from the memory of those experiencing involuntary neural responses to stimuli, such as psychedelics or migraines. On the right are examples of how ancient shapes were fixed artistically into Paleolithic art. So to begin, what is meant by involuntary neural responses? This optical illusion allows you to experience a type of involuntary neural response. Keep in mind that the motion is happening in your head and not on the screen. So you are visualizing an involuntary motion, but without being intoxicated. I will now discuss how the model functions. Setting up the model involved 3 steps. The initial experience of an altered state of consciousness is often brief and marked by visualizing geometric shapes that lack immediate interpretation since they pass quickly through an individual's vision. For step 1, neurologists and psychologists from laboratory and cultural studies have chosen the commonly occurring involuntary shapes. Step 2 established a consistent vocabulary for describing how the shapes are perceived to move. Step 3 is the perception and interpretation of the endogenous shapes as hallucinated iconic imagery developed. I tested the model with Warpa art from the early intermediate period and used 20 endogenous shapes. The choice of these endogenous shapes has one limiting criteria. The only psychedelic intoxicant that I could reference that was applicable to the ancient South American setting and based on laboratory reports was mescaline from studies of peyote consumption. Fortunately, the intoxicant mescaline is found in San Pedro cactus that is easily accessible in the Ayacucho region. With the 3 steps established, the recording of the endogenous shapes followed 3 stages. Stage 1 relies on the choice of the 20 shapes, and stages 2 and 3 relate to the changes as the shapes progress into iconic imagery during an altered state of consciousness. All of the endogenous shapes move, and all can become fixed images, such as a spiral from hallucinating the spinning of vortexes. Of the 20 endogenous shapes, I found only 13 painted on Warpa style pottery. Yet 10 of them could have been generated by either the intoxicant stimulus, mescaline, or a non-intoxicant stimulus. The several non-intoxicant stimuli include ocular migraines. That generates several shapes, of which 4 are warpa, as well as rubbing the eyes, putting pressure on the eyes, staring at a bright light like the sun, head injury, and such. The ocular migraine experience begins with a black oval shape, or scotoma, that enlarges to obscure one's vision. The edge of the ellipse has clusters of parallel zigzags and fine hatch lines, often colorful, known as the fortification pattern, that look very much like the hash lines that you see on this warpa jar. I cannot show you an example because since it could trigger the experience in anyone who is sensitive to having these ocular migraines. Once I learned that non-intoxicant stimuli could produce endogenous shapes, I questioned if the model had the integrity to explain the 13 warpa shapes as indicators of intoxication. And at this first step in the analysis of just the shapes with the early phase of the warpa pottery style, I decided that it cannot beyond reasonable doubt. In other words, the shapes could be generated by both intoxicant and non-intoxicant stimuli, such as those 4 warpa shapes from migraines or mescaline. However, with intoxicants, consciousness is altered and visualized images progress towards hallucinations. The shapes change as described with stage 2 attributes, and then can be interpreted as iconic representations as described in stage 3. It seemed that the early phase of warpa art was stuck in stage 1. Fortunately, evidence of warpa stylistic change over later centuries is available. And here is where the model becomes relevant. Later warpa art complies with stages 2 and 3, thereby linking the early phase as an artistic foundation with the later phases of warpa imagery, and therefore sets the origin story of the psychedelic through line. So, a closer look at warpa chronology is next. The early and late dates are based on C14 samples associated with pottery. The middle dating references pottery that are stylistically seriated between early and late examples. To recap the early phase, an initial structured layout is important for identifying warpa art from other Andean black on white pottery. Warpa potters consistently divided up the vessel's surface with vertical and horizontal black bands into a grid-like pattern of panels filled with design motifs or a solid black color. With the other contemporary pottery styles, white cruz pottery combines the warpa standard of a white background and black outlining with borrowings of the most obvious Nazca origins of recurved rays and multicolored designs. Whereas brown cruz pottery is also contemporary, but has so far lacked a study of its origin. Warpa art in the late phase shows significant change that may be an indication of sociopolitical involvements with neighboring populations and points to a surprising origin of brown cruz pottery. To continue the psychedelic through line, I will be focusing on the warpa tricolor and brown cruz pottery from excavations carried out by Juan Leone, Martha Cabrera, and Jose Ochotoma, as well as the Freddy Lagos collection at Ayacucho's Ministerio de Cultura. In 2001, Juan Leone excavated the warpa site of Ñawinpucyo that is located on a hilltop in the southern suburbs of Ayacucho. This is what it looks like today. This old satellite photo is closer to what it looked like in 2001. The East Plaza encircled the ceremonial warpa compound that was later surrounded with Middle Horizon warpa occupation. The area must have continued to hold a sacred quality to the Wari, who did not encroach or destroy this warpa architecture. Some pottery that I will be discussing came from excavation units in this area. This is a closer view of the compound and the 3-walled circular building. The ritual nature of this compound is enhanced by the positioning of its entrance that lines up to the peak of Razawilka on the horizon. And here one could go, or can go, to discuss of Apus and Wamanis as Warba cosmology of indigenous mountain deities. But I will continue with the pottery evidence. Motion is an essential indication of an altered state of consciousness, and thus design elements and motifs on pottery that suggest movement are relevant. The late phase examples of Warpa tricolor pottery are possible examples of the stage 3 progression with more artistic animation. This example shows how the L-spoked ray motif became an elaborate swastika-like shape that most likely tries to capture a visual image of rotation. The spiral shapes and multiple wavy lines exhibit the attempt for expressing spinning and vibration. This elaborate spiral motif with cartoon-like whisker lines is remarkable in an animation to indicate spinning. These two Warpa tricolor vessels are also examples of stage 3, in which Warpa art captured the psychedelic imaginations of iconic images. These vessel shapes still remain similar to earlier white Cruz-Pata and Warpa black on white vessels, but have images that I interpret to be iconic creatures with legs and feet attached to a round eye shape as a possible abbreviation for a head, with ray extensions such as hair or ecstatic symbols. With iconic imagery, Warpa society was most likely consuming psychedelics and date the use of San Pedro mescaline, becoming the entheogen with sacred affiliations at Warpa's ceremonial center. So how did Warpa potters arrive at such dramatic reinterpretations of their artistic experiences? Documented descriptions of ecstatic imagery from mescaline include experiences of flickering lights, sparkling crystals, and explosive star-like experiences. Brown Cruz-Pata designs appear to capture how potters illuminated motifs with extreme contrasts of white elements against a dark background. A rosette of recurved rays is delicately edged with white dots that give the impression of sparkling lights. Painted on a dark background, this white L-spoked radial motif appears to glow. White star-shaped radials give the effect of bursts of light. What is the origin of the Brown Cruz-Pata pottery style? I suggest that a solution can be found with two designs that do not originate with Ayacucho or South Coast populations. The first is a complex crenellated pattern with filler elements and nested circles. The second is a vertical band of diamonds with stippling filler dots. Though it is not yet possible to know if Ayacucho's neighbors immediately to the east originated such shapes, possibly Panoan groups, evidence for comparative origins does exist in the Tucano art, as studied by Gerardo Reichel-Dolmatov. His work influenced Lewis Williams and Dowson to employ Tucano ecstatic art in their model. Between the Tucano in northwest Brazil and Ayacucho populations, a straight distance of 1,600 kilometers or 1,000 miles, are many tribal groups. However, ethnohistorical and current Tucano traditions describe linguistic exogamy that developed their extreme multilinguistic expertise in middleman trade status. Their knowledge and social position allowed them to leverage a diverse economy of trade that may have linked ancestral trade networks. Tucano art includes many endogenous shapes, such as grids, zigzags, concentric circles, and brilliant dots that can be created during intoxication. Their crenellated patterns and columns of nested circles and diamonds show significant similarities to the Brown Cruz-Pata examples. Thus, Tucano art supports the possibility that Brown Cruz-Pata style represents an Amazonian origin. As such, it demonstrates a network of sociopolitical relationships that placed the Warpa society in a middleman position of economic exchange between the eastern Amazonians and the south coast Nazcans. The exchange most likely included psychedelics other than mescaline. Therefore, white Cruz Pata and brown Cruz pottery are evidence of Warpa's networking to establish an Ayacucho presence to the east and to the west, respectively. Whereas it is important to point out that only the Amazonian networking continued south into the Cusco region. To show that the Warpa middleman network did not involve the Cusco populations, I will compare the Kodacay pottery found at several sites in the Cusco area with Warpa pottery style. Though the Kodacay style is a black on white style, it is not related to Warpa black on white. The shapes are different. Even with the most similar shape, a tall open bowl, Kodacay have straight sides and a footed base, whereas Warpa has slightly flaring sides and never uses footed bases. Design execution is starkly different. Kodacay potters use double fine lines to outline design fields, whereas Warpa used black outline bands borrowed from Nazca traditions. I tried to find similar facial imagery, since both styles use tear lines below the eyes, yet Warpa tends towards square-shaped eyes and painted noses. Kodacay designs columns of stippled or hatched-lined diamonds and zigzags are obviously more similar to the Amazonian brown Cruz Pata style. So this third-party origin should direct further research into Amazonian and Cusqueño relations in the early intermediate period. So what became of the Warpa middleman status? The research of the Lewis, Williams, and Dowson model was limited to mescaline use and most likely consumed at Warpa's Hilltop ceremonial compound. The Throughline continued to a new psychedelic preference. The evidence of this new preference is the pottery from the same D-shaped structure at Concha Pata that depicts A. calabrina. Carlos Mencia provided a possible reconstruction of the image. Note how the plant is growing out of a head. I don't think words are necessary to explain the meaning here. Rather, it is a psychedelic meme. I introduced you to this imagery with a brief introduction to the SACE. Now to begin, the psychedelic through line from Warpa to Wari. An important attribute to follow is the use of the interlocking fretband that encircles the rayed head. The origin of the A. calabrina image may be from snuff tablets. On the right, the plant depiction is clearly similar to the Concha Pata pottery style, with wavy stems, flowers, leaves, and seed pods. And it appears to be growing out of a human head, encircled with an interlocking fretband. But when, along the Warpa to Wari psychedelic through line, could potters have gained knowledge of such an image? These tablets from Tiwanaku are not dated, and those from San Pedro de Atacama that have the SACE are so rare that there is only a suggested 5th and 6th century association. So further investigation and dating is needed. Thankfully, the psychedelic Warpa to Wari through line can be followed on other jars from the D-shaped structure. Along with the A. calabrina body sherds, there were rim sherds from wide-mouthed jars that depicted other unusual plants growing out of heads encircled with interlocking fretbands. This is 3 views of one jar. And a close-up of a head encircled with an interlocking fretband. Though the A. calabrina body sherds include a handle, a neck juncture, and no rims, it is still not possible at this time to determine if these sherds came from below the neck of the wide-mouthed jars that do have rims. Of significance for dating these vessels is the warp-up style black on white geometric column. In other words, pottery manufacture that documented psychedelic knowledge was still a Warpa-controlled tradition. This cultural circumstance along the psychedelic through line also indicates the possible additions of other psychedelics, such as psilocybin. A preference for A. calabrina, or as Inca called it, vilca, shouldn't be unexpected once it became available. When consumed as a drink, mescaline in San Pedro cactus has a bitter, sludgy consistency and can cause vomiting, whereas A. calabrina seeds are ground into powder and consumed as snuff or in chicha drinks, a more appealing alternative. As you can see, there are 2 more body shirts that indicate 1 or 2 more jars. The unknowns are being researched. Further confirmation that Warpa traditions control the psychedelic trade is the fact that the wide-mouthed jars retain a traditional Warpa shape. These are not Middle Horizon vessel shapes. And other rim shirts from large open vessels in this late Warpa style are most likely from wide-mouthed jars. They display combinations of conservative Warpa black-on-white design rim bands and layouts with panels filled with early Wari-style recurved ray design elements. Therefore, the functioning of a Warpa agency to enforce a stylistic identity in ceramic art and to be involved in ritual intoxication trade continued to be acknowledged into early Middle Horizon. The transition to the Middle Horizon was gradual and blended. The crucial result of this observation is to propose that these Warpa vessels are potentially the earliest evidence of the Sais in the Wari homeland. This evidence also follows the tradition of the rayed head icon that had been traveling around the Andes since the early Horizon Paracas culture, as documented so well by Ann Peters. While the enforcement of Warpa entheogens developed in the Ayacucho population, the early origin of the Sais, as presented by George Haberle's provincial Pucara style, was flourishing in the south coastal areas of Siwas. Much later, provincial Pucara influenced Tiwanaku and Wari style iconography that continued many details of the representation of the A. calabrina as seen on this Wari textile. 2 circled black dots for the flowers, hatched leaves, and the seed pod that I suggest is depicted on the provincial Pucara deity staff. This observation about the staff is important for understanding the purpose of staffs as power tools. A relevant attribute of the A. calabrina wood is that it is a very hard wood and rot resistant, and the Inca used it for their staffs. Haberle's provincial Pucara style, mostly in textiles, established the most complete core of the Southern Andean iconographic series that proved essential to the development of Wari and Tiwanaku ceremonial art. The A. calabrina icon has been identified on numerous types of artifacts. Most Wari examples are in textiles and pottery. Tiwanaku art with this plant symbol occurs mostly in carved stone. This medium of information storage was expected to endure forever, to affirm Tiwanaku as a center for ceremony and pilgrimage, whereas Wari invested their entheogenic identity into more portable objects, such as pottery and textiles, to archive knowledge. Portable objects allowed for easier dispersal, innovation, and adaptability within a growing complex social landscape. Thus, A. calabrina motifs were crucial symbols of identity in the Wari strategy to gather partnerships into a hegemony of divine authority. I will now introduce this symbol for the first time on one of the most ostentatious of portable objects, 4-cornered hats. More so than ceremonial pottery that would have limited distribution, Wari hats are more visibly accessible and identifiable of an individual elite status. In my humble opinion, there is nothing more important to an authoritarian empire than elite identity. For my research, I have compiled a database of nearly 250 4-cornered hats, and I'm working on a publication. Sadly, only 23 have a provenience, 23 out of 250. Such hats tend to have small diameters and were worn atop the heads of elites. Their heads had been modified into elongated skull forms a process that began at birth to a chosen few. How such children were chosen is not known. Such cranial modification of elites occurred as long ago as Paracas culture, as seen with the reconstruction on the left, as well as among the Nazca and the Wari, and at Tiwanaku, as seen on the right in the ceramic vessel. As a group, it's likely that their public appearances would reinforce an impression of divine authority. One result of this research is realizing that an image that I had thought was a human head with bird wings was wrong. And following the criteria described earlier, these images represent the A. calabrina growing out of a human head. The wings are the leaves. The rays ending in squared dots are the flowers. The seed pod here may be the hem of the squared dots. This thematic schema has its variability, of course. There are no two hats in the database that are exactly alike. With the hat on the far right, even the head is missing. All of these hats are Wari hats, except the one on the far right, that is a Tiwanaku hat. All contributed to maintaining the psychedelic through line into the middle horizon. I now want to discuss how hat production supports this assumption. The hats are not woven, but created with a technique of knotting the threads. Therefore, they do not unravel. The style of the knot is known as lark's head. It is important to understand that there are two distinct techniques in forming these knots. One uses a needle to sew colored threads into knots, and designs are created by simply sewing on the next colored thread. The final fabric is a single layer. This technique is believed to have been used for Tiwanaku hats. The other technique is like knotting a fishing net with a shuttle and gauge and a single brown colored thread to form the foundation fabric. Designs are created by adding colored thread at each knot and later cutting them short to create a pile-like surface. This technique creates a thicker fabric and is believed to have been used for Wari hats. Thus, there are 44 Tiwanaku non-pile hats in the data, and about a quarter have A. calabrina design elements. With the Wari-made pile hats, there are 191 in the data, and about a third are with A. calabrina design elements. Up until now, textile studies have also deferred this Wari technique to needle sewing in a very long foundation thread, upwards of 8 meters. However, each knot has 2 loops. So for the average sized hat of 80 rows, 200 knots each, a needle would pull a thread through 32,000 loops. So the probability of fraying the thread makes sewing impractical. Here is where another lark's head knotting technique is the solution. The other lark's head technique is known as the reef knot. Here the knotting does not occur at the end of the thread, but at the point it comes off the bobbin. So fraying and length are not concerns, similar to looping techniques like crochet. I came up with this technique years ago, but only recently was Granger's publication kindly pointed out to me. However, a challenge remained. How to get from the open fabric of a net to the tightly bound fabric of the hats. Here, I developed the concept of using a punch-like tool with a blunt end. This tool can push a thread through the tight space between knots in the previous row without weakening the fabric. I've been trying to find such tools among Middle Horizon textile equipment. So far, I believe I have found them as wooden dowel tools at 3 Wari sites on the coast, Castillo de Guarmey, Ancon, and San Nicolas. As shown, a small dowel is inserted into a pre-drilled hole in a larger dowel and cut short, leaving a blunt end. In the highlands, where wood and textiles rot, Ochotoma and Cabrera illustrate a possible one made of copper and bone from Acahuaco, Ayacucho. I use the term punzon for this tool that Ochotoma and Cabrera used, and I'm looking for more. With the assumption in the textile literature that Wari hats have a pile surface and Tiwanaku hats are a single fabric or non-pile, Do the 23 known proveniences support this assumption? Basically, yes. The Wari pile hats cluster in the north and the Tiwanaku non-pile hats in the south, but with three exceptions in the north that turn out not to be similar to Tiwanaku hat designs. So I am discovering more regional diversity in the production of such hats. The hats are personal items that carry significant identity and not likely used as trade items. So if there is a question of contact between these two cultures, here is another line of evidence. For example, I found it remarkable that the Warmay hat is so similar to a Tiwanaku hat found in the Pulacayo cave in Chile, associated with Tiwanaku style textiles displaying the captor-captive deity theme. Could someone have traveled that far or some kind of connections? Before Warpa's descendants subscribed to a Wari stylistic tradition, the imagery on the wide-mouthed jars documents Warpa's earlier achievement to recognize the economy of psychedelic resources and distribution. Most significantly, they passed on that knowledge as recorded imagery that is evidence that control of the drug trade was still in the purview of Warpa authority, possibly with shamans. It was up to a growing generation of ambitious leaders to reinforce the Warpa network. So I will end the story here with an unquestionably astute understanding of the Warpa culture from Luis Lumbreras, who suggested a hypothesis that Nyamanpukyo was the capital of a Warpa regional state. I hope that this research helped to confirm his keen insight. Thank you, and many thanks to the Institute. Thank you. Thank you.